G'day everyone, Happy New Year. This is Chris from CSWR Repairs, and today we're looking at an English pocket watch, which actually bears a very strong resemblance to an American Elgin or Waltham, and you'll see why once we get to the winding and setting. In this video, I'm going to take you through a couple of procedures that I use for removing rust. Now, as with any videos that I do with a lot of these watches, I sort of just go along and see what happens. I actually can't really prepare or repair, so I kind of make it up as I go because there's always a surprise waiting for me. So in this one, I'm starting off by doing the usual and just getting an overview look as to what's going on, what the situation is, what I should be looking at. In those first few frames there, you saw that there was a broken casing screw, which I'm going to have to address. So just keeping things in the back of my mind that I have to address as I go along. And as I'm continuing, I'm obviously removing the bezel and begin the procedure to remove the movement out of the case. If you have a pocket watch with a negative set, which it is in this case, no pun intended, you have to remove both casing screws and put the crown in the time setting position to remove it. And this is because the position of the stem is dictated by the sleeve that's inside the case, which I'll show you once I remove it. So again, having a close look at what I'm dealing with, and it looks like this watch had a bit of maybe water ingress or even potentially just due to sweat. But given that you can see a fair bit of rust in the sleeve, and you can see it also in other parts of the mechanism, which I'll show you some close-up footage in a moment, it tells me that it's definitely had a fair bit of moisture around it at some point. So this is the dust ring, I think they call it, which I'm removing, which also has a bit of rust on it, just a bit of surface rust because it's brass. And again, just inspecting every little bit. For a large part of this video, which I haven't done in my previous videos, I'm going to fast forward a lot of the footage to save time, because a lot of it is just me doing manual work that I guess a lot of you have seen many times before, and I want to try and slow down and save time for some of the more, I guess, interesting repair procedures. Well, hopefully they're interesting for you. So yeah, it's not going to be super fast, you still know what I'm doing, but generally just, you know, brushing past the things that are a little bit more straightforward. That hour wheel was actually a little bit difficult to get off because of the rust that you can see now in the cannon pinion. Never a great sign, because that really means that a fair bit of moisture has gotten into that particular watch. Thankfully though, the cannon pinion wasn't rusted onto the center wheel pivot, which is a good thing, or else that would have been a little bit more difficult to sort out. And in this close-up, I'm just showing you a little bit about what I'm seeing through the loop. I guess the numbers and the model of the watch itself, just for interest. The general condition is not terrible, but the rust is the particularly worrying bit. So now I'll take out the large movement holder. And one thing, if you are looking at working on pocket watches, is always keep an eye out for that fourth wheel pivot, which I'm pointing out there with the tweezers, and you'll see here a close-up of it, because that one always pokes out, and it is possible to get that caught up and jammed in the movement holder, so you don't want to break that. And also try not to lay the movement face the dial position down, I guess, because that pivot can bend and break very easily, and if you do bend it, it's very hard to straighten it. I guess 70% of the time when you try and go and straighten it, you end up snapping it, which is unfortunate. So here again, as with every watch, I'm following the same procedure. Checking the end shake of the balance first, and this one is pretty almost non-existent, pretty gummed up. There's little to no end shake, and I think any gummed up oil would have caused it to just not move at all, so not a good thing, something I have to address. I'm also pointing out in some of these videos, I'm sorry that they're a bit blurry, they're hard to focus with the macro camera, but you can see there's rust on the stud and the stud screw, which led me to fear something which unfortunately became reality, and I'll show you that in a moment. And the thing that I was fearing was a rusty hairspring and a rusty stud. That's always a difficult thing to deal with. It's never easy to, I don't know, how do I say this, remove it without, I guess, interfering with the rest of the balance. But I'm going to do my best in this video and show you how I approach it. I would definitely love to hear feedback on other methods if anyone has a better method on it. Yeah, I carry on with, again, making mental notes of what I have to address and eventually repair. The reason I don't stop and repair everything as I'm going along is because I don't want to get to a point where I find a part that's irreplaceable or irreparable, and then I've wasted all this time repairing all this other stuff and I can't actually get the watch working. So yeah, this is why I check everything along the way and just make mental notes. One thing you would have noticed here a couple of frames ago was that there's no power running through the drain, so that's something I have to investigate. That tells me something's mechanically lodged, and if moving it didn't free it up, then something else is going on there. So again, with that click wheel that I just took off, I did see a lot of surface rust on it, so I put it aside, and I'll deal with that in a moment. Actually there was no end shake on the barrel. You see here with the back of my tweezers, I attempt to push down on the other to, I guess, bend the main plate a little bit just to add a bit of end shake, and I think I was successful in adding just a little bit. And carry on, I remove the click. Generally good practice, because in particular if you've got rust anywhere else, as suspected there'll rust under there as well. So anywhere that water can hide and sit for a while and oxidize, you'll get rust. And definitely under here, under the crown wheel, which I'll show you a close-up, that got a fair bit of rust, a couple of missing teeth as well. So now we're going to address the broken casing screw that's jammed inside the barrel bridge. And to do this, we're going to use a staking set using I believe it's called a screw extracting punch or something along those lines, and the stake. Hit it a couple of times and the broken bit just comes out pretty easily. So as usual, checking all the end shakes, and I'll get a normal speed shot here. You can see there's too much end shake. If you can see it from that far and it's got that much movement, you're almost guaranteed that there's too much. So we're going to address that issue in a moment as well. Little tip here when working with barrels, you see this a lot in pocket watch ones, is here you've got a little scratching mark. That should line up with the notch in the barrel lid. You'll generally see a mark going from the barrel lid to the barrel drum, or a marking pointing at the notch, or basically something that will ensure that the lid goes back in the same position in relation to the drum as it came off. So here I'm just using a bit of tissue paper to clean some excess grease off the barrel arbor so I can inspect it a little bit better. And as we can see, there's a couple of score marks there. They're not too deep, they're not too bad, but we are going to polish those out because, as I've mentioned in one of the previous videos, everything adds up in the end. So you've got a couple of score marks here. They could chew up maybe 10 degrees, 15 degrees of amplitude by the end of it all, so you want to address it. Make sure you cover the mainspring very well once you're taking it out, and don't do it at eye level. I had to sort of do that there just because of the camera work. I don't like doing it. But that mainspring is pretty much dead. As you could see in that frame there, it was quite coiled up. It wasn't open and large as a normal mainspring is when it's new. So here we're addressing the issue of too much end shake. I'm using a solid ball punch from a staking set, and I'm sitting that lid on a barrel closing device, which I'll show you in a moment, and I'm just pushing down with my hands. I'm not using any force hitting it. So you can see this red section here is domed, and you want the lid to sit on that, and with the round nose punch you push down on that to basically warp it so that the bend is towards the barrel drum, and that way it'll reduce the end shake. So I've just pushed on it a little bit. This is all trial and error, but the best thing about it is if you find you have no end shake after this adjustment, is you basically just turn the barrel upside down and you push on the arbor and create more end shake, and that's easy enough to do. So I'm closing up the barrel now, and I got pretty lucky. So the first time round I managed to get a perfect amount of end shake, as I would describe that. So we'll get a bit of a close-up look on here. Very slight movement. That's what you want. You want freedom in there, but you don't want too much end shake. Many reasons for it. I can cover that in another video in more depth, but essentially you don't want that barrel to wobble around and touch either the bridge or the main plate. So here I'm just carrying on with the usual process, checking the teeth on the wheel, checking the pivot, and then checking the pinion and all the wheels of the gear train. So here we can see a little bit of rust on the upper fourth wheel pivot hole or bearing, and that's not going to be a good sign about the fourth wheel itself, so we'll see what we find. What I'm doing here is just cleaning the pivot of the third wheel with a bit of Autosol, which is a steel polishing paste, and pegwood, just to clean out the pivot to make sure that it's as clean as possible when it's going in the cleaning machine. And here's the fourth wheel, a lovely layer of rust all throughout the pinion and the pivot, so we're going to have to address that a little later on. And as we're getting to the winding and setting, for anyone that's familiar with Elgin and Waltham pocket watches, you'll see that this setup is actually very similar to the American system. So I'm not really sure of the background of or the history of this particular English-made watch, but it bears a very strong resemblance to an American watch, and yeah, have a look here at the similarities. Show you a close-up. It's basically identical apart from the spring, and obviously it's all rusted out, which is something we're going to have to address as well. So I'm using a bit of pegwood there to make sure that the spring doesn't shoot away once I'm pulling it all apart. So a brass brush is very useful for removing rust, especially off the brass plate, because it can get into all the little nooks and crannies of it. But also you can just rub it on a piece of paper to get very light surface rust. You can add a bit of polishing paste to get slightly heavier rust off it. And also use a brass brush again to get into any corners and such. But we're going to take it a little bit further with this particular watch because we had so many parts that had rust all over it. In particular all the screws, some through the threads, and there's a lot of ways you can tackle it, but I used one particular approach in this video to hopefully try and make that process quicker. So I'm loading all the rusted parts into this cleaning basket here, and what we're going to do is put it through first a clean of a solution called Evapo-Rust, which you can Google on, and then I'm going to wash it with water and then put it into this jar, which is shellite, which is a hydrocarbon which will disperse the water to dry it out, and then I'll put it through a cleaning machine. So I've put a little Wi-Fi microscope here which I'll be recording on to show you the process of how I polish the barrel arbor. I'll be using the gusset stone and a burnisher, and in the following clip you're going to see a little red arrow pointing to a particular section of the barrel arbor. I want you to look at the lines that start forming on the barrel arbor. You will see first the lines start to disappear, and you get one sort of face, I guess, or one plane on the arbor itself. And that's when you know all the scoring marks have been removed and you're basically ready to go on to the next polishing step. So you see that the lines slowly start disappearing and you get just one surface. It'll become a little bit clearer once I use the burnisher, but that's basically the principle of it. You remove the deeper scoring marks or the deeper cuts into the metal with an abrasive stone, slightly more abrasive stone, and then you move on to your burnishing, which is a polishing finish. Here you see the same thing, except this time you start seeing polished lines appearing as the whole face of the arbor becomes polished. So this whole process, this is very fast forwarded. It took me about 10 to 15 minutes, so not too long, but you just keep using that burnisher, keep wiping it away, cleaning, adding oil, until you get one polished face. So clean, check it, and still not 100%, so do a little bit more. So I've cleaned it up, put more oil, and as I carry on, you start seeing a nice polished surface. With the next one here, I've put an arrow there to one particularly stubborn line, which you see that I keep burnishing and all the rest go away except for one. So what has to end up happening is I just have to go back one step, so use the gusset stone. Obviously this means that the line is too deep for the burnisher to get rid of, so I have to go back one step, use the abrasive one to take off extra material, and then come back to the burnisher and finish it off again. And now you've got a polished barrel arbor. So now that the parts have been through the Evapo-Rust, the water and the shellite, I'm going to put them into the cleaning machine for one pre-clean, and then we'll come back and revisit them. While that's happening, we'll quickly clean the dial, and I use a very highly secretive formula that you have to contact me. I'm kidding, you don't have to contact me. It's just lens cleaner. I literally just use lens cleaner for my glasses. Windex is another thing you can use. Anything that gets rid of grime and grease. To be honest, I don't want to do much more when it comes to these ceramic or porcelain dials, because they can be fragile, and sometimes the writing on those is painted on. Very rarely, they're usually cooked on or baked on, but to be safe, just use something light like glass cleaner or something like that. So the first step in addressing the case is we have to remove that crown. So I'm using some flat jaw pliers. You can use parallel pliers as well to hold the stem while I unscrew the crown. This now gives us access to the sleeve, and as you can see, as would be expected, it's highly rusted. So now we use a sleeve key to undo that and get the sleeve out and see what its condition is. Yep, both stem and sleeve rusted. Highly expected. This is one of the other weak points of the watch. You can imagine even just sweat, condensation getting in under the crown. Remember, in those days there were no gaskets or seals for these watches, so yeah, very easy for water to get into. So now we're going to be removing the springs. First spring will be the one that opens the lid from the case, and the next spring will be the one that actually locks the lid in. Now, to remove these, you can see a little gap on the spring there where the arrow was pointing at. You'll see a pin that goes through the case. You'll see a little hole, and basically a little pin sits in there, gets pushed in, goes through the case, goes through the spring, and then normally, hopefully if someone's repaired this properly, they've made the pin short enough to be able to push it through, it'll fall in, and you'll be able to get the spring out. Now, even though it looks like I'm having a go at this case, I really want to emphasize the fact that I'm using very minimal force here. I'm not forcing anything at all. Now I'm knocking that pin in a little bit further because the first time around it didn't push through. And when I keep trying to remove it from the case, look, I'm using my number 2 tweezers and they're not bending or getting damaged. You can see that there's not a lot of force being applied here. So I just want to really emphasize it, that don't force anything. If the spring is ready to come out, it will come out. You don't have to force it or do anything extreme with it. So that arrow is just pointing to the little hole where the pin gets pushed in through, and it's nearly there, so I've just got to push it in a little bit more. So in this case, I actually just pushed the spring back in and it managed to dislodge the pin, and that's when I noticed it and I thought, okay, cool, it's now ready to come out, and that spring should just fairly easily just come out, just like that. So that little bit there, sort of just after the halfway of the spring, that's what the pin is actually sitting inside of, and that's what's holding it in. So if you imagine a pin in the case and then going through that little hole in the spring, that's what's holding it all together. Very important to remove these springs if you're going to polish the case or clean it in any way, and the sleeve and the stem and all that, because most people don't, and this is why they get rusted. You'll find normally that they're usually rusted on the back part, because on the front you can clean it, but getting to the back of the spring is not as easy. So here I'm removing the hinged side. Again, just using tweezers and that broken oiler, which you can get from Bourgeon. They're about $300. No, I'm kidding. Just use any broken oiler. You can use anything that's kind of flat and pointy. And now we've removed that spring there. So here we have the watch parts that have just come out of the cleaning machine. This is after they've been through the evaporust, the water, the shellite. And one thing that you'll find with pretty much any derusting agent is that it leaves a black tarnish, and it also strips hands and hairsprings of all their bluing. So that's something that we're also going to have to address on this watch. So one way to remove this black tarnishing from flat objects is by using a little bit of polishing paste. I use here something called Autosol, which is a steel polishing paste, and just rubbing that on a piece of paper. That worked to a certain degree with a lot of these parts, but didn't provide a very good finish, so I did use some other methods which I'll show you a little bit later on. So what I've done here is I've just put a little, I think it's a cotton or felt pad that you normally use with a Dremel, and I've loaded that up with Autosol, and I'm just holding, in this case, a winding pinion with some tweezers, and it's very easy to get rid of all the rust and black tarnishing from within the pinion leaves and teeth. So you can see there you get a pretty nice finish just by doing that on the lathe. I prefer the lathe because you can do it at a lower speed. The Dremel tends to get too fast and flick things away. So anyways, I used this process for most of the parts that I could hold in a pin vise, or just use my fingers with, including the ratchet wheel, the crown wheel, and the click, pretty much all those little bits and pieces. And in this part here, I'm just loading up a step collet to put in the fourth wheel. As you remember, the pivot and the pinion were all quite rusted. The rust is now gone, but you're left with the tarnish. And unfortunately I can't do the pinion on this, but I can do the pivots with this, so I just really run a flat bit of pegwood with Autosol up and down the pivot while it's spinning, and that gets rid of all the tarnish. And the pinion will have to be done manually, as you can see here, and I apologize for the recording. It was in and out of focus the whole time. It's a little bit hard with the stand, but there's no easy way around it. You just have to basically sharpen a piece of pegwood in the same shape as a screwdriver, and use Autosol or some other sort of rough paste to get in there and get rid of the tarnishing and the rust as well. So that's pretty much the only approach that I can think of. To address the casing springs, I load up a Dremel brass brush onto the lathe and simply move the springs back and forth, pretty much allowing that to scrape off all the rust. I could use a brass pen that I showed you earlier, but this method allows me to get into the curves a lot easier and really just work this a lot quicker, more than anything. There are steel brushes available for the Dremel. I don't see why you couldn't use that. I do prefer the brass just out of precaution to not scratch anything more than necessary, but feel free to experiment with that. Now for the screws, I've gone a little bit old school. I actually quite like this tool. Using again Autosol, I loaded that up onto the 3 wheels of this tool, which is, the first one is some sort of metal. I think it's probably steel, although it could be zinc or tin. That's what's traditionally used for polishing. The second wheel is brass, again with Autosol, and the third wheel that you'll see there is wood. I find it pretty interesting. You can use just one particular paste, and all you do is you change the wheel that you polish it with, and it actually comes up with a nice finish. Now, I want to make it clear that it's obvious that this finishing isn't black polishing, but it's pretty damn good for spending less than 2 minutes per screw on it, and I think it's a pretty good result. The next bit is addressing that flat pivot on the balance wheel, and for that I'm going to use a little pivot polishing tool, which I've loaded up onto a little motor thing that I've made from parts from J-Car. And I'm just using that burnisher, the same one that I use for the barrel lava. And if you see carefully here, I'm tilting it upwards as I'm polishing, so I'm keeping it first flat and then I'm rounding it off, because what I'm trying to do is get rid of that flat on the top of the pivot. You'll get a closer shot, I think, here of the machine, the way it's working. Basically, the pivot just sticks out of this fine piece of metal, and from there you're able to just address the end of it. So you wouldn't polish an entire pivot on this, you would use a Jacko tool for that. For this, you would really just address the end of the pivot. So using this method, it gives us the desired result of having a more rounded pivot end, which will lead to reduced friction and such, and better performance. So after all that, I've put all the parts in the cleaning machine, and the watch should be pretty much ready for assembly once I get a new mainspring for it. And let me know if you have any questions in the comments, or if you have any other things to raise. And let me know if you'd like to see a video of assembling this particular piece.